A new cemetery marker unveiled at the Factory Point Cemetery in Manchester on Saturday, August 6th, points out an interesting tale from the town's past. In 1793, almost 230 years ago, a vampire panic spread throughout Manchester, and many local residents of the time came to believe that the body of a recently deceased young woman, who had died in 1790, needed to be exhumed from its grave and her vital organs destroyed, in order to protect other still living people from the ravages of tuberculosis, a wasting disease then called consumption. Histories of the time inform us that hundreds of people flocked to a 1793 heart-burning ceremony of Rachel Harris Burton, the first wife of Captain Isaac Burton, at a local blacksmith's forge. This was to protect the health of Captain Burton's second wife, Huldah, who was also struggling with the same disease. Many believed it was due to an evil vampire which had occupied the deceased body of Rachel, Isaac's first wife. Unfortunately, Huldah, the second wife, who was a stepsister of Rachel Harris, also eventually succumbed to tuberculosis. But for a time, the vampire hysteria swept the town. The Manchester Historical Society helped to create a site marker in conjunction with the Vermont Folklife Center and the Pomeroy Foundation, which is based in Syracuse, New York. Sean Harrington, the Historical Society's curator, gave the background at the unveiling ceremony.
So this story came about, John S. Pettibone, he would call him one of our town fathers. His father, Seth Pettibone, bought the farm from the Tory Samuel Rose, which is now the Wilcox farm. So if you leave here and want to stop by and have some ice cream with Brittany, that's where Mr. Pettibone lived. John was an officer in the War of 1812. He was a probate judge. He represented the town of Manchester in the state legislature. Kept meticulous notes. Very well respected man. He wrote a manuscript in 1860 where he kind of where he wrote down a lot of his memories, stories that have been told. And it's about an 18-page document typed. And Mary Campbell Munson donated to the Vermont Historical Society, and they reprinted them in 1930. You can see this online. What was interesting was this was just one little paragraph in that whole manuscript. And as I was reading it, because I read Loveland Munson's oration on the early history of Manchester, and he cited the Pettibone manuscript, so I naturally went and found the Pettibone manuscript and read it. And then there was this one small paragraph about the demon vampire. And I read it, and I was just like, wow. So I did the next best thing, so I went on to Google and found somebody had cited, had written about it and said, and we searched Delwood Cemetery and couldn't find any sign of her. And I said, well, if she was burned in the forge of Jacob Mead. Mead is very synonymous with Factory Point. It was Mead's Mill, then Factory Point, now Manchester Center. I said she'd be in the Factory Point Cemetery. So I wandered up and down the rows and found her. And was thrilled. Not only did we have a story from the 1790s, but we also had a gravestone, and a very unique gravestone at that, carved by Zerubbabel Collins in probably 1791. Really lovely piece. I'm just going to put a little plug. So if you want to read a little bit more about all of this, you can go to just Google Town of Manchester Vampire, and John has put together a great website that has the entire thing.
My name comes up first, actually.
The Pomeroy Foundation sponsored and paid for the historic marker, said Andy Kolovos of the Vermont Folklife Center.
Well, this particular story is part of a kind of constellation of stories that run from the 18th century through the mid-19th century about vampire outbreaks or vampire belief outbreaks all over New England, so from southern New England up to Maine. Is it unusual? Generally, I would say it's unusual in the United States to have these kinds of stories because we normally associate them with Eastern Europe and the Balkans. So it's a curious thing to see it crop up here, but it was definitely part of something else that was going on. A point I made to Sean as he was reading the piece earlier to me, I was like, you know what's fascinating? How many things like this might have happened that no one bothered to write down? Like what don't we know about small events like this that occurred in communities that we'll never know because there's no record of them.
So is this situation here relatively unique to Vermont? Or are there any other references to Something comparable around the state?
The other story I'm aware of in Vermont is associated with Woodstock, and it's a bit later. And that's the only other one in Vermont that I'm aware of.
Rachel's gravestone itself has an interesting story. It was one made by Zerubbabel Collins, who was a highly respected maker of gravestones who lived in Shaftesbury. More than a century after the Salem witch trials, Manchester had its own bout of vampire hysteria, which was not uncommon across the New England states in early colonial and post-colonial America. Such bouts of hysteria were often linked to outbreaks of tuberculosis at the time. The marker is prominently displayed beside the main entrance to the Factory Point Cemetery. For the GNAT-TV News Project, I'm Andrew McKeever.